Our opening words today are adopted from Thomas Merton. We are living in the greatest revolution in history, a huge, spontaneous upheaval of the entire human race. Not a revolution planned and carried out by any particular party, race, or nation, but a deep, elemental boiling over of all the inner contradictions that have ever been. A revelation of the chaotic forces inside of everyone. This is not something we have chosen, nor is it something we are free to avoid.
Good morning and welcome again to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Oak Cliff. I have the distinct pleasure again to deliver this sermon this morning. My name is Ryan Conley and I again welcome you. Today's source of the service is our Jewish and Christian traditions. I'm actually going to be speaking about the Bible, which is not something that happens very often in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, but I thought this day would be a really good day to do it. There is little doubt that when I examine the various books which make up the modern Bible, there is one book, and only one, that stands out among the rest as my favorite. That would be the Book of Esther. Maybe it is because my maternal grandmother was named after the heroine. Maybe it is because it is the book before the book of Job, which I find absolutely appalling. Perhaps it is that God, the ultimate drama queen himself, is suddenly and strikingly absent from the text. The word God appears in no part of the text of the Book of Esther, which is shared by only one other book in the Bible. Perhaps it's because it has not only one, but actually two women who stand up to authority and stick it to the man. Among a canon which largely subjugates the role of women and tries to downplay their significant contributions to history. The text contains an eerily apropos message that I hope you will learn to enjoy. Since it's a very short book, only a few pages, anyone can sit down and read it in a single setting. I will give you a brief summary of the book, and I do encourage you to read it yourself if you have the time. Modern scholars today understand that this is probably a work of fiction, that the Book of Esther actually never did happen in history. What they think is actually there was several non-Jewish holidays which the Jews liked to celebrate because they were spread out through all over the Middle East. So they would adopt to local customs. And they kind of adopted a holiday and made it their own through some type of Jewish traditions and beliefs, much like the Christians did for Christmas. So the story of Esther takes place in what is the Achaemenid Empire of Persia in the 4th century BCE. The king Ahasuerus, who is thought to have been also known as King Xerxes I, was the ruler. According to the text, he was ruling his empire from within the fortified part of the city of Sush, which today exists as the city of Susha in modern-day Iran. To celebrate the 3rd year of his rule, he decided to throw a party with all of his officials and courtiers. This was quite the party. It didn't last 6 hours or 6 days or even 6 weeks. It lasted 6 months. Oh man, they sure knew how to party back then. At the end of this party, to show off all his riches and treasures, he decided to allow the common folk around the city to join in the celebration and threw a 7-day feast. These commoners were no doubt exhausted with all the drunken well-to-doers that sprawled around the city for the last 6 months. Yet there was still plenty of royal wine to go around, and the drunken king advised that there was no limits on how much each guest could consume. On the final day of the feast, when the king was, in the text says, high in spirits by the wine he was drinking, he ordered his servants to bring the queen Vashti. and so that everyone in the feast could oogle after her. So when all the servants came down to the part of the palace where the queen was hosting a feast of her own, something remarkable happened. She told them to stuff it. Oogle this! This, of course, enraged the king, but no doubt created an unprecedented situation that had to be dealt with. So the king consulted a bunch of very smart people. Yes, that's what actually the text says. Judges to try to figure out what to do. No queen had ever refused an order like Vashti did. And their largest fear was that the news of what the queen had done would reach all the women of the kingdom. They might start doing the same thing with their husbands. We clearly cannot do that. The important women of Persia and Media who hear about the queen will tell the royal officials the same thing. As it says in Esther 1:19, there would be no end of put-downs and arguments. In the end, the royal decree was sent out among the empire that Vashti was quietly ushered away and she would be replaced by someone who knew their place, and that husbands should rule over their own children and wives. So they started a search for a new queen. He sent among the empire people looking all over for these beautiful women, something that I can only define as some type of elaborate 12-month-long beauty contest. Miss Persia contest? They underwent 6 months of treatment with pleasant-smelling creams and 6 months of fragrant oils. Whomever among these women the king liked would replace Vashti as queen. This is where we learn of Mordecai, a Jew, that was among the tribes that were exiled to Babylon. Mordecai had raised his cousin Esther, whom was an orphan. Esther was caught up in the beauty contest and taken to the palace to undergo various beauty treatments. And before she left for the palace, Mordecai told her, you better not tell him you're Jewish. So she stayed in the closet, as it were. So Esther made quite the impression, apparently, and eventually won the beauty contest, and she was made queen. Mordecai worked as one of the palace guards, primarily guarding the gate. As such, he was able to keep track of what was happening to Esther. And while he was there at the gate, he overheard a plot against the king. So he reported it to Esther, who reported it to the king, and the two servants were executed in a rather disturbing way by impalement. Or according to the VeggieTales biblical children's account of Esther, sent to the land of perpetual tickles. Esther made certain that Mordecai was credited with the information, and something that will become important later. In comes Haman. Haman. He somehow became one of the most powerful men in the city, likely due to the incompetence of the king, who seemingly was more interested in drinking and womanizing than actually running the kingdom. There is an often overlooked clue about Haman in the text, that he was an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag. And if you know anything about the Bible, you know that in 1 Samuel 15, the Hebrew God himself ordered the genocide of the Amalekites. The absolute destruction of the Amalekites, including the women and children, and even, strangely enough, the livestock. Agag was apparently the only survivor, as Saul spared him against God's orders, to which God regretted having made Saul king. Wouldn't he have known? King Ahasuerus ordered that everyone should kneel and bow before Haman. All did so except for Mordecai. It was a Jewish thing, apparently, that he would not bow before any man. Well, that really upset Haman. And when Haman learned that Mordecai was a Jew, well, let's say he decided to take out his revenge. So by literally rolling the dice, a date was chosen to carry out the mass slaughter of all the Jews within the empire, and Haman would get his revenge. It was a very easy task for Haman to convince the king to allow him to do so. No doubt the king's alcohol-addled mind, Haman only had to whisper a few things into his ear and tell me if this sounds familiar. There are a certain people within your kingdom. Their laws, their customs are different from everyone else. They speak a different language, and they refuse to obey your laws. They do not worship your gods. Haman, sweetened the deal with a lofty amount of silver for the king's personal treasury. "Hey, cool deal," said the king, who was clearly not interested and perhaps capable at all in reigning the kingdom. And he took off his signet ring, which was used to seal royal decrees, and told Haman, "Both the money and the people are under your power. Do as you like with them." With that, Haman gave the order to kill all the Jews in the kingdom and did so in the name of the king. After having a justifiable freak out, Mordecai was successful in convincing Esther to try to stop Haman's order. It was said that she did this in the true fear for her life, because nobody could come before the king unless they were summoned. If you had such impotence, it means you will be executed. So she dressed in her finest clothes to try to win the favor, walked over to the throne and standing in front of the door and was hoping for her chance. The king saw her there, called her before him, curious as to why she came, and that he would grant her whatever she wished, up to half the kingdom. She instead asked him to come to a feast with Haman that she had prepared. And while they were sipping wine, the king asked what she wanted, to which she asked, to come, and she replied that she would like for them to come to another feast that she would have for them tomorrow. And from there, she would answer his questions. Upon leaving the feast, walking in front of the palace where he was feeling pretty good about himself, he again saw Mordecai. This is Haman, of course. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. Haman walked in front of the gate and saw Mordecai, who promptly and basically ignored him and showed no sign of fear. And this really pissed off Haman. So he gathered up his friends and family and sat there and bragged how wealthy he was, how many kids he had, how much power he had. And he had basically he was given the king's ring so he could basically act like a king. Sound familiar? He especially bragged about getting invited again to have yet another feast with the king and queen the next day. Yet he complained that it loses all meaning every time he saw Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Poor guy. So his friends decided the best solution was to erect a 75-foot pole and convince the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. Something strange happened that evening because the king couldn't sleep, so he asked his royal servants to read to him. So probably the most boring thing they could possibly bring to read was all the chronicles and the royal decrees and stuff. So they were reading through that, and they came upon the part where Mordecai informed people of the assassination attempt, which the king asked, "Did we do anything for this guy?" And they said he didn't. The next morning, after erecting that 75-foot stake, feeling pretty good about himself, Haman came to the palace to ask the king to have Mordecai executed. But instead, the king asked him, "What should we do for the man whom the king really wants to honor?" Well, Haman thought he was talking about him, so he just proceeded to explain this elaborate ceremony of riding on the finest horses, wearing the king's robes and wearing the crown, and parading around the town and have people shout, "This is what they do to you if you're favored by the king." And the king turned to him and said, "Great, do that for Mordecai." Well, Haman did so, but afterwards returned home humiliated, to which his wife didn't give him much support by saying, if he has Jewish blood, you will not be able to win against him. You are surely going to lose out to him. While talking this over with his wife, the servants from the palace came to fetch him for the feast that Esther had prepared. At the feast, the king asked, okay, now for 2 days you wanted to ask me something, and I assure you, you'll get what you ask. So Esther asked for her life. And she pleaded for her life and the life of her people, exclaiming that we had been sold out. The king appeared to be astonished and angry. Who would do such a thing? And Esther replied, a man who hates an enemy. This man, Haman. The king left in anger, and Haman began begging for Esther for his life. When the king returned a few minutes later, after seeing him groveling with the queen, he angrily orders the death of Haman on the very same 75-foot stake that Haman erected for Mordecai. Esther needs to plead for her life again, and she begged the king to rescind the order which would kill all the Jews. Well, here's the thing, and something that really hasn't changed much since then. The king cannot be wrong, ever. Rescinding an order would make the king look weak, indecisive, and prone to making mistakes. They had to find another way other than rescinding the order. So Esther explained that Mordecai was her family, that he raised her as a daughter, so the king essentially replaced Haman with Mordecai by giving him his signet ring, and Mordecai was able to issue a new decree that the Jews could now kill all of their enemies the day before they were supposed to be killed. And, of course, there was an expected bloodbath. So today, the Jewish holiday of Purim is celebrated every year and it was as this past Thursday and Friday was Purim. Sometimes it's called the Jewish Mardi Gras because it's kind of a similar thing. There's a big party on the streets, marching, costumes, elaborate costumes and celebration, and beads, all that stuff. And it usually falls around the same period of time every year. And there's lots and lots of drinking. And some of the Jews, that's the only time they actually can drink, is during Purim. Esther's story seems timeless, as we can clearly see much of the storyline playing out even today. An incompetent leader, blinded by his own power and desire to impress others around him. Opportunistic oligarchs trying to win the favor of a king in order to press their own hidden agendas. There's a minority population that is affected by prejudice, that are scapegoated and blamed for their very existence is threatened. We see people like Mahmoud Kahil, a legal permanent resident of the United States, having his immigration status challenged simply for his advocacy for his people, and essentially held as a political prisoner, threatened with deportation for doing nothing wrong, for committing no crimes, just speaking out against a policy. What I find most significant part about the book of Esther is when Mordecai was trying to convince Esther that she needed to do something to stop Haman. Mordecai says, do you think for 1 minute that unlike all the other Jews, you will come out of this alive simply because you are in the palace? In fact, if you don't speak of this very important time, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from some other place, but you and your family will die. But who knows? Maybe you find yourself in the place for just a time as this. For just a time as this. Pastor Ben Boswell from the Myers Park Baptist Church said this earlier this year. One of the reasons we grieve today is because we have been told quite clearly that the election of Donald Trump will lead to the crucifixion of people we love. It will lead to the crucifixion of immigrant families, women in need of reproductive rights, transgender and non-binary people, sick people in need of health care, government workers clinging to a job, poor people needing resources. So we grieve today with our entire body for those we love. But every crucifixion needs a witness. Pastor Boswell lost his job for those words. So, my friends, we find ourselves in a place for just a time as this. It seems a bit pointless to hope that Melania will finally tell her husband to stuff it and oogle this. Can you imagine the spectacle of a long, drawn-out, elaborate beauty contest which no doubt would ensue to replace the First Lady? I'm almost certain it would be some type of presidential version of The Bachelor. Perhaps a new Queen Esther will emerge and finally convince the Mad King that something is amiss, but that doesn't seem likely. We instead find ourselves in a place just a time as this. And it might be that all we can do is be a witness to the suffering. To stand with those we love and bear and witness and loudly proclaim that it's wrong. It might be that we can do is advocate for those around us suffering due to the policies of this administration that clearly go against our values. We can tell these victims that we love them, support them, and will advocate for them. Our identity does afford us a great deal of protection, and so we can be there for them so they won't be alone when these things happen to them. For such a time as this, the world needs to hear us, and we need to make sure that others do not look away so that they will see what is truly happening. For such a time as this.
Our closing words today come to us by Heather Rion Starr. To soulfully survive this world's mayhem. May whatever gatherings or activities we engage in this Sunday afternoon help to restore us, help to restore our connections to one another, help to restore our sense of hope, beauty, and fun in this world. Help to restore our deep knowing that we have to take care of ourselves and each other with love and joy if we are to soulfully survive this world's mayhem.